It's just a science project.
Silent breed is people!
You know, a doctor friend once said the same thing to me. Frankenstein was his name.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
That sounds like something out of science fiction.
Please explain to me the scientific nature of the whammy.
We live in a spaceship, dear. So?
Yes, science!
Program complete. Enter when ready.
Hello and welcome to Science on Top. This is episode 208, and today is Thursday, the 26th of November, 2015. My name is Ed Brown, and I'm joined by Penny Dumsday.
Hello.
And virologist and vaccine advocate, Dr. Dave Hawkes.
Hi, Ed.
We've got some cool stories coming up. The incredibly diverse DNA of tardigrades, parasitic worms that boost women's fertility, and some potentially concerning news about flu vaccines. But first, Dave, let's talk about the neurosurgeons at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Centre in Canada, who at least claim to have found a way to deliver chemotherapy drugs directly to the brain, crossing the famous blood-brain barrier. Now, we've got to stipulate this is just based on a press release, and I don't think we've seen any peer-reviewed papers yet, but they're a fairly credible bunch of people. And if what they say is true, it's going to be a fantastic and exciting development.
Do you need me to comment any more on that? Yeah, so
What did they do, or what do they say they've done?
So I guess the thing is just to sort of, I think, you know, as you said, this is a press release, but it is coming, and as Buffy the Vampire Slayer as it sounds, Sunnybrook Health Sciences Centre does seem to actually have a good program. So they've got a brain sciences program. They're associated with the Division of Neurosurgery at the University of Toronto, all this sort of stuff. And what they've done is they've got a patient who's got a tumour in their brain, and in an area bordering the blood-brain barrier near that tumour, they've actually put in chemotherapy and also microbubbles, and then used MRI-directed low-intensity sound waves to target the blood vessels in the blood-brain barrier. So with this chemotherapy and these tiny microscopic bubbles, I don't know why a microscopic bubble isn't tiny anyway, but anyway, this is what happens when you get press release written by PR people. So they've used MRI-guided low-intensity sound waves. So this is sort of ultrasound in my understanding. I'm a biologist, not a physicist, so I have that wrong. I apologise. And essentially they're using these blood vessels to disrupt the blood-brain barrier. So I guess if you think of a wall with all the cement, that cement is like the tight junction between the cells, and that sort of makes up your blood-brain barrier. It's a bit more flexible than cement, but these bubbles can sort of jiggle the cement so that things can actually slip between the bricks. But then once they stop jiggling, then the cement can settle back down and you have an intact blood-brain barrier. And that's essentially what they've done. They've used it on the chemotherapy drug. It's flowed past the blood-brain barrier because I guess with the blood-brain barrier, things that are very small can get across it. So if you're looking at, you know, sodium or potassium or a lot of those other things, they can get across it. But things that are larger, and so complex molecules, chemotherapy drugs, a lot of pharmaceuticals won't be able to cross the blood-brain barrier. So this could be a way of actually targeting the cancers without actually perforating the blood-brain barrier, because you can inject anything you want into a brain tumour, but that hole in the blood-brain barrier doesn't repair, and it has the potential for side effects. It has the potential for infection, all those sorts of things. I mean, Mel Thompson had a spinal tap, which again you could argue is going through the blood-brain barrier, and it didn't heal, and that sort of led to more and more sort of issues that she ended up having to go into hospital again. And that's, you know, she talked about this at the Skeptic conference. I'm not sort of giving anything away that hasn't been said in public. I'm not giving her medical records. But it just shows that even the simplest perforation of the blood-brain barrier can actually lead to a series of complications. So this could be a way that we can actually sort of use the permeability of the membrane that the actual body uses to get, you know, different things across it in such a way to actually sneak drugs across it. And from what they've said, you know, they have a background, they have all this sort of, you know, knowledge. It seems like a really good idea. I mean, it is funded by the Focused Ultrasound Foundation. So,
Whoever
read
they
into
are.
well, considering they're using focused ultrasound, it's either great, they're getting some free devices, or it's very good marketing. Either way, it doesn't necessarily rule out anything.
Yep.
And in fact, I suspect the actual ultrasound device is provided by this company. But what it actually has the ability for, if this works, so it's not going right across the brain, and there is a whole bunch of methodological issues we can't solve without actually seeing a peer-reviewed paper. But what it means is if you have a condition in your brain that means you need pharmaceuticals and they're not easily crossed around the blood-brain barrier, you might actually have to give somebody them into their body, so their blood or the muscles, at a higher dose so that a lower dose sneaks across the brain, and that can cause, obviously, the higher the dose, the more chance of side effects, particularly if they're going to an area that doesn't need them, like the non-brain part of your body. So if we could use this to actually get drugs into that sort of blood-brain, across the blood-brain barrier into the brain and that sort of privileged site, that could allow us to use lower doses of drugs and actually target these diseases more effectively. And that can only be good because we're learning more and more about the brain. It's certainly one of the biggest areas of research in the world. And any way that we can actually be active, because a lot of the brain research is quite passive, any way that we can actually develop treatments, so get something actually into the clinic, into something that patients can do, can only be a good thing. But again, it's really novel. It doesn't seem particularly invasive, which is great. And yeah, it's just it's a really interesting, very preliminary sort of study, and yeah, it's quite cool.
It sounds very cool. I'm wondering, I mean, they obviously talk about targeting where the drugs enter across the blood-brain barrier, but is there going to be an issue where, I mean, what if the cancer is deep in the brain, away from the blood-brain barrier, or is it still able to get there, or is it sort of once it's in, it goes to all in the brain, or? We don't know without seeing the paper and more information.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, when we look at this, they say, okay, well, this was done, the tumour was close to where they did this. Now, close is a relative term. So when we were doing injections into the brain with viral vectors, we were aiming for, these are animals, not humans, but we were aiming for fractions of a millimetre. And then when we actually looked at the brains of these animals afterwards, because they had a fluorescent protein, we could tell exactly where our virus had gone. These guys are putting in chemotherapy. We don't know, did they have to put in, 10,000 molecules for every molecule that actually hit the cancer? We don't know. We don't know how far it spread. Did this, they said it was adjacent, it was close. Did this spread across a quarter of the brain to get the cancer, or is it 6 millimeters? These are things we can't really answer. And in terms of, exactly whether chemotherapy specifically would be able to use deeper in the brain, I don't really know, because chemotherapy has a whole variety of other side effects. But if you're looking at actually just a pharmaceutical treatment, something that, it probably wouldn't be. But, if you're doing something for someone with like a severe panic disorder or something or a severe epilepsy where you need a treatment that the next step up is sort of removing part of the brain, then this could be something that you go, well, we can use this as another tool to actually treat these things. So I can't really give you specific answers, but I guess I'm trying to give you a bit of context of, if you're looking at something, if you've got a receptor on the brain that's overactive, then you could actually use this quite generally, and that might work. But it would depend on the individual pharmacokinetics and toxicity of the treatment being used. Sure.
Okay. Well, it's definitely an exciting development, and certainly one to follow. And I'd really like to see what some other experts think once they see the paper and we get this sort of into wider scientific circulation. But one to follow. Well, Penny, there are some infections that seem to lower a woman's fertility, but now it seems that women infected with roundworm have more children. Different types of parasites can have different effects on a woman's fertility. Is that right?
Yeah, and I mean, this is just continuing our worm story trend on Science on Top. But I found it interesting because a recent study has found that some worm infections can actually increase fertility. So it's not as very simple as we think. So this is a case of Indigenous people living in the Bolivian Amazon. They don't tend to use contraception, and the average woman over her lifetime will give birth to 9 children or so, which to me just respect those women. Like, absolute respect. But also in these communities, parasitic worms are very common, and about 70% of people will have a worm infection. And this study looked at about almost 1,000 women, 984 women over 9 years, and found that women who were infected with a hookworm had their first child later and had longer gaps between each child, but women infected with roundworm had an earlier first pregnancy and shorter gaps between children. And so projecting this out, they found that essentially, compared to the average, if you have a roundworm, you'd have 2 more children, and with hookworm, 3 fewer. So that's a difference of 5 children over a lifespan between someone with the fertility-enhancing worm and the fertility... Oh, what's the opposite of enhancing?
Decreasing, diminish?
Diminishing worm.
Inhibiting?
Yeah, which inhibiting, that's the word. It's huge. Like, that's enormous.
Yeah.
That is an enormous effect. And they said that these, it seems to be pretty robust, that this is actually caused by the parasite and not by something else.
Well, that's what I was wondering, how much of this is just a correlation sort of thing. But there's a strong a link then. They're pretty confident in that.
So obviously it's really interesting, but we don't know exactly what's going on. It's almost certainly to do with the immune system of the woman and the way it interacts with the worm. Mm-hmm. Apparently hookworm infections produce a different mix of immune cells to be produced by the woman's body to roundworm injections. So hookworms produce more of this type 1 T cell, and roundworms produce more type 2 T cells, which tells cells to produce antibodies instead of directly going and attacking. But how this actually relates to fertility is a bit unsure. One possibility is that these cells that directly attack germs might harm an embryo, because apparently in pregnant women this type of cell is decreased in production. So it could be that the immune reactions prevent pregnancies in women who have hookworm because they're producing more of these immune cells that attack an embryo, whereas the ones with roundworms are producing more of these antibody ones, which may somehow help embryos survive. So,
wow,
like interesting.
Yeah,
I mean, my first thought is, of course, how can this be, applied to either get some more effective contraception or fertility enhancing drugs? And I think let's wait and see. But it's just fascinating.
On my Tinder profile, should I say that I have a roundworm? Is that permission?
Well, that sounds too much like a euphemism, so I don't know if you should go there.
It's better than a hookworm. That is a euphemism.
Yeah, I agree.
And also, I think, just as with the celiacs and all their worm sort of things, don't just go out and get a worm infection.
Yeah.
I mean, a worm infection might help to enhance fertility, but it also has it can also have complications that might be quite dangerous and life-threatening. So I just find it interesting the way that our bodies do interact with all the other organisms that live on us and around us that we sort of like to forget about.
But it's not just that. It's also things that we tend to demonize. Like we talk about the bad bacteria and we try and clean everything with antibacterial wipes. But of course we need bacteria, and there are good bacteria. And so maybe the same is with the bad hookworms or the good roundworms or whatever you want.
Parasites. Yeah. It's an interesting one, isn't it?
No, very cool. And I would be interested to see if there are any studies that we can do to sort of mimic this, as you say, as a contraceptive or as an aid for fertility. It would be interesting if we could, synthesize some of the chemicals that produce these reactions.
Vaccinate.
It would be fascinating, yeah. Yeah, a vaccine, imagine.
Yeah.
That would if you're talking about an immune response to a certain pathogen, then surely the best way to do that would just be to have a vaccine.
Yeah. So hopefully there's some research into that now. But speaking of vaccines, Dave, a lot of people diligently get their flu shot every year when flu season comes around. But there's some growing evidence that seems to suggest repeated vaccination against the flu might diminish the vaccine's effectiveness, which sounds really counterintuitive.
Yeah, I guess just to be very clear with this, in all situations, you're better off to have the flu vaccine than not to have the flu vaccine.
Yep.
So you've got this. This is an interesting observation, and it's something that I'll go into in a minute. But it comes down to this: is that every year you make the decision to get the flu vaccine or not, and every year the evidence is you should get the flu vaccine. I mean, I was at a clinical vaccinology seminar yesterday, and they were sort of saying that most flu vaccines aim between 50 and 70% effective, which is obviously not as good as, say, measles, mumps, rubella, but the flu changes every year and different strains have different prevalence. So 50 to 70% effective is pretty good. Yeah. But if you do have it every year over a period of time, it doesn't work as well than with somebody who has only had the flu vaccine for that year and hasn't had one for the previous 5 years. Now, I've actually heard of something similar to this before, sort of related to, and the idea was that if you have the flu vaccine in, say, 2014 and you're exposed to the flu in 2015, you're not that protected. But if you've actually had the actual influenza virus in 2014, you actually have quite a lot of protection for the next year or two, because the virus that you get is only 12 months apart, whereas the vaccine you get is based on a virus guess about 9 months before you got it. So you're actually 2 years off. So that's something that's kind of related, that's been around for a little while. But what these guys, and I will probably mess this up because I'm a virologist, not an immunologist, and that doesn't mean that much. But to me, viruses are beautiful and elegant. The immune system is like the tax office. It is like the tax office. It is bureaucratic. So if I get any of these wrong, I apologize. But the idea is that if you have the flu vaccine every year, you have sort of this build-up of sort of response. And so it might actually just stop part of the virus, not the whole virus. Whereas if you have the vaccine straight, for the first time in 5 years, your body's primed and it's ready to take out the entire virus at any point. So that's a very dumbed down version. The reason it's dumbed down is because it's all a bit Greek to me. But this is the idea. So it's really interesting. It's good to know sort of what actually happens, because, I mean, people forget that influenza kills 200,000 people a year, and that it does kill sort of 0 to 1 year olds, but it causes way more death in sort of people over 70. And so it would be really interesting. And these are obviously a 1 year old is probably not going to have 5 years of annual flu vaccines. It's probably unlikely. Whereas a 65,
but I've heard how babies are just injected with so many vaccines all at once.
I'm like, bring it.
Yeah, I'm just kind of going, yeah.
Can they have more?
Yeah, if you can give a vaccine for a child to be annoying when they're teething, yeah, I'll give them that every week. My son is teething at the moment, so I'm a little bit sleep deprived.
And I should say I was being facetious then, just in case people haven't heard that well-trotted out line from the anti-vaccination brigade that, they were giving too many vaccines all in one go.
I'm waiting for the vaccine for the common cold. Come on, people.
Yeah.
No, it's not.
Yeah, more common cold research needed, I think.
Do you guys, would you realise what would be involved in that? You'd be working in a lab where everyone would have the common cold all the time. I had a friend who worked in a flu lab, and he said it was the worst 2 years of his life.
Oh, my God.
Every time they worked on a different strain, he got the flu again.
Think of the children. Think of all my clothes that are covered in snot.
Anyway, let's come back to the flu vaccine.
So this is not justifying my complete slackness about getting the flu vaccine very sporadically. I should still be more on top of things. and get it every year.
Yeah, and I mean, the good thing that's happening, and again, this is something I heard from someone who is an expert in the field, so any mistakes are purely mine, but we've had the introduction this year, so mid the 2015 season in Australia, of the quadrivalent. So that protects against 2 strain A's and 2 strain B's. I think it's pretty cool just because I was actually involved in the clinical trials. With my PhD in virology, I classified as a guinea pig. So I was actually injected with it, and then,
it's good to know that PhD is good for something.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's like, I can fill out my name, date of birth, the whole lot. And so this was a few years ago, and now it's been added to the schedule. And what I'm understanding is that it will actually become the standard flu vaccine, and that it will actually it's obviously better coverage, and it could actually be even more beneficial and raise that sort of 50, 70%, sort of, raise it up an extra couple of percent. So I would certainly, I get the flu vaccine every year. I work in sort of hospitals and other bits and around medical people, and they all get it because the last time I had the flu was in 2009, and I was literally could not get out of bed for a week. And yeah, it's very serious. It's particularly serious with when you've got exposure to young children. So this is a really interesting point, and it will have some benefits, but what you're actually talking about is a couple of percent, sort of 5%, maybe even 10%. But it does actually not actually change your behavior, because each year you should be getting the flu vaccine. And if you want to go 5 years without this so you can get that extra 5%, it's a bit counterintuitive. It's a
bit Russian roulette.
Yeah, it's sort of, it's academically really interesting, and it could have some big effects, but in the day-to-day pragmatic life, each year you're offered the flu vaccine or not, and each year you're always better to get the flu vaccine.
Fair enough. And just, you mentioned trials then. Dave, you're currently involved in setting up a trial comparing 2.5 yearly pap smears with 5 yearly HPV tests. Do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. So I can't actually take credit for doing this. This is done, it's called the Compass trial. It's been done with the Victorian Cytology Service, where I work, and the Cancer Council in New South Wales. And the pilot started in the end of 2013, and we're looking at 120,000 women in Victoria between the age of 25 and I think it's 65, because what's happening is we're getting rid of pap smears. I know a lot of women.
I was
about to say women are going to be talking about this.
Oh no, let me cry.
It's not quite perfect news, but essentially a pap smear, every 2 years, they take a sample of the cervix and they look at the cells. Now, that's reduced Australia's cancer rates, cervical cancer rates, down a lot from about, I think it's 6 and a bit per 100,000 down to about 1.9. So it's done some great things, but it's not perfect. And what's actually happened, a lot of research has been done, and it's shown that HPV causes 99.7% of cervical cancers. So if someone doesn't have one of 14 strains of HPV, essentially they don't get cervical cancer. And I am saying person, I'm not saying woman, and the reason is that this affects transgender men as well. So anyone with a cervix can be affected by cervical cancer. And so what's happening in May the 1st, 2017, in all of Australia, we will move to HPV testing. Now, unfortunately, it's the same sample collection, so a speculum.
Oh.
But wait, it's every 5 years.
Okay.
And
that's good. I feel like Homer Simpson. Oh, that's bad.
And it doesn't start until a woman is 25. So the next generation of women will get, instead of being 18 to 20, will be 25, and they'll go from, I think, about 26 PAPs to about 9 HPV tests. So it is a big drop, plus the HPV is better. So HPV at 6 years between when you have a HPV test and coming back is still more effective than 2 years for a PAP. So that's sort of the background of this. And this decision has been made, and it's been made by a couple of successive governments. So this is not a cost-saving thing or anything like that. What it is about actually giving women better chance of predicting which sort of strange cells will become cancer, because if you have some abnormal cells, it could involve a treatment, and that treatment could actually, there is a risk that will affect the ability of a woman to carry a baby to term. So we don't want to treat if we don't have to, and the HPV is a way of sifting that out. So with the COMPASS trial, we're recruiting women. So any woman with a cervix or any person with a cervix between 25 and 65, we've got a website called COMPASS Trial, and we've got a Facebook site. So just go and check it out, and there's a little button on the COMPASS study page, and that will actually take you to a page that you can put in your postcode, and it will tell you where your nearest clinic is, and then you can go and speak to the doctor whether or not it's something you'd like to take part in. It's been going for a couple of years. Essentially, women go and have their sample. 1/3 go to traditional Pap, so if you are going for a Pap smear, really that's not going to change anything. But 2/3 go to the HPV, and so if you get a HPV test, if you get a negative HPV test, you'll come back in 2020. So that's sort of what I'm involved in. I'm doing the HPV testing. That's sort of my job now, and so yeah, that's what we're doing.
Does that mean, like, just say you're tested and you don't have any of those strains?
Yes.
And you're not sexually active, like, you wouldn't need to go again, or is it just worthwhile just continuing to?
That's a clinical question.
That's a clinical question. No, that's okay. It's just interesting, that's all.
But I guess the thing to remember is that sexually active means a lot of different things.
Yeah,
so we definitely know, for instance, that you can get HPV from sex toys. There is some thought that you can get it from digital penetration, or there definitely can get it from oral sex. There's even some people that think you might be able to get it from kissing. So the range of sort of different sexual practices, all of them carry a risk of HPV. So this is why we give the vaccine to girls when they're 12 or 13 and to boys at the same age now.
I'm wondering about why does the HPV test, surely can't you just do that as a blood test? Why do you still need to do the scraping?
My understanding of this is that the HPV doesn't get into your blood. It's not HIV. What it does is it gets into your cells. Like, you think about warts.
Yep.
You get warts in a very specific spot. So you might get on your fingers, or you might get on your genitals or your feet or wherever it was. You don't get warts everywhere. Okay. Warts are a HPV virus.
Yep.
And so it goes into a particular layer of cells. Again, I'm still catching up with some of the actual biology of the cell part of things. The viruses are beautiful cells, again, clunky and ugly. And then it's localized, which is why we can treat cervical cancer really well, because what happens if you have a lesion, a woman has a lesion on her cervix and they remove the lesion, they can essentially remove the HPV.
Yep. Okay.
And then she can be clear for the rest of her life.
Okay. Well, that sounds very cool. So definitely encourage people to check out compasstrial.org.au. We'll have a link, obviously, in the show notes to that. And if you're eligible, sign up if you have a cervix. And you're in Australia.
Victoria.
Victoria. Okay, cool. As usual, all the links are on the web at scienceontop.com/208. We love to hear from you, so please leave us a comment or drop us an email, feedback@scienceontop.com. And, of course, there's Twitter and Facebook and Google+. Dr. David Hawkes, so great to have you back on again. Where's the best place for people to find you on the internet?
Generally, I still lurk in the see-me underside that is Twitter, so at Mr. Hawkes, MrHawkes. But yeah, if people are also around, I'm involved in Stop the AVN, and there's been a lot of work happening there and a lot of information, particularly with the new no jab, no pay laws that have been passed in the Australian Senate. So if you go and check that out on Facebook.
Terrific. And of course, thank you, Penny.
Always a pleasure.
And thank you, everyone, for listening. And we'll be back again next week, putting science on top of the agenda. Join us then.
Why are only 23% of flu vaccines effective?
So every year is a gamble. You make the vaccine 5 months before the flu comes out.
Why? They're bullshit.
You put in the what you think are the components that are going to work, and it varies year to year. So it's 23% effective.
What else would we use this method with? Let me just guess what would work.
Meaning?
Meaning, if you're guessing what would work and you don't know, and you're going to inject that into your body, that's a good plan?
Well, but we know that with a constellation of the components in the vaccine, each year we dramatically reduce the likelihood people die by tens of thousands of people. So this year's vaccine, we have a particularly virulent strain that has what's called genetic drift. It can change on the spot.
Yeah.
Well, so, the vaccine is effective in reducing, to some extent, you're right, that one of those strains, only 23%.
23, Doc.
Effective against the others. And so the idea that we don't give people the vaccine, we're missing out on that chance of thousands to benefit.
We will agree to disagree.